Okay, everyone, welcome to this week's seminar. And before I introduce our speaker for today, I'm going to mention next week, which is the last week for this term seminars, and then we'll kick off again in mid-January at the start of next term. We've got an exciting lineup that will be revealed next week. Before I introduce today's speaker, just to mention the next two events we have. So next week we've got a double whammy. On Friday we have two speakers. At 1 o'clock we have Joe Roman talking about Eat, Poop and Die, how animals make our world. And Joe is in particular famous for his early work on the whale fertilization pump, how whales dive deep and fertilize surface waters and the carbon associated with that. So he's come over from the US. He's a very charismatic speaker, and he's got a book titled Eat, Poop and Die, which is what he'll be talking about. And then at 4:15 at our regular slot that day, we've got Charles Foster, who's a local academic and author, who'll be talking about the screaming sky with the strange allure of swifts. And Charles is someone who's fascinated by swifts, and he tracks them from Oxford to Mozambique and back, and tells the story, his story around the swift. So that's at. I read that book a few years ago. It transformed the way I saw swifts in the sky, and it turned into my favorite birds after reading that book. So that's at 4:15 on Friday as well. So you're welcome to both of them. I'll mention one other event next week, which is at the Oxford Martin School at 5 o'clock on Thursday, which requires registration if you're interested in that. And that's Mike Barrett, who's head of WWF UK, talking about the Living Planet report and presenting the latest Living Planet report. And that's next Thursday at 5 o'clock. Okay, so it gives me great pleasure to introduce today's speaker. And John Payne is a UK-born tropical biologist who's resided in Malaysia and Indonesia since 1975 and has at least 25,000 hours living within the rainforest. I was impressed by that statistic. He headed WWF in Sabah from 1982 to 1998, and now heads a small specialist NGO, the Borneo Rhino Alliance, and aims to highlight the knowledge and actions to enhance the survival of the rhino and other rare species, which is the topic of his talk today. So welcome, John, and thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. So thanks, Yadvinder. Just to check, sound is fine, is it? Thank you. So thanks again to Yadvinder, not only for this introduction, but to CEI for hosting me, bringing me here. A couple of other thanks. One is to Jonathan Spencer, who's lurking in the background over there, and his wife, Alison, who last year read this book, which I wrote a couple of years back, and thought it has a number of valuable lessons in nature conservation. And it happens to be a rhinoceros that's going to go extinct probably fairly soon. And the main thing I think that attracted Jonathan was that it shows failure, a whole 100 years of what all went wrong. Nothing very new, but often doesn't get published. I must also thank Ben Goldsmith, a philanthropist who paid for the cost of me coming from Malaysia, traveling around UK for 2 weeks. That's probably what I need to say. Okay. So the origin of this, what I'm going to give for about up to an hour. I do tend to go on. I did check with Yadvinder. I'm allowed sort of up to an hour. I understand it's flexible, but I want to say a lot. And the origin was this particular animal. Now, I'll say a bit about this first slide first. So the thing on the left, there's this sort of logo, Borneo Rhino Alliance. And it turns out there's a long backstory, but I and some colleagues in Malaysia set up an NGO in 2008. And the idea was to have a sort of last-ditch attempt to prevent the extinction of this species. And I would also just mention this, the species scientific name is Dicerorhinus sumatrensis. It's usually called the Sumatran rhino. I call it the hairy rhino. I'll try and elaborate why I think that's better later on, although it's a small point. It turned out that the two last hairy rhinos in Malaysia died in year 2019 under the care of my NGO, Borneo Rhino Alliance. And rather than close down, when I say we, it's myself, a very experienced Malaysian wildlife vet, a few admin people, and in total 18 mostly early school leavers from Sabah. Should also just mention, for those who are not familiar, Malaysia, like many nations, is a relict of a colonial era. So Malaysia consists of Malaya, Peninsular Malaysia, mainland Asia, Sabah, the northern 10% of the island of Borneo, used to be, excuse me, British North Borneo, now Sabah, and Sarawak, the western side of Borneo, another 20% or so. So that's Malaysia. So we decided to carry on sort of with a lessons learned motivation, that we saw all the reasons to do with human reasons and biological reasons why that species went extinct in Malaysia in 2019, and how to try and preempt at a much earlier stage, preempt what I think are inevitable extinctions of all the other large mammals of Southeast Asia. All, I believe, will go extinct unless there's preemptive interventions to target how to recover the numbers that have declined for whatever reason the last century or so. So Borneo Rhino Alliance is our official name. It's a not-for-profit company in Malaysia. Bringing back our rare animals was a sort of an attempt to have a tagline. So that's a tagline, reusing the BORA sort of idea. And we have a website if you just want to note down bringing back our rare animals. So that's the general background. Next, let's see where we're going. So a few things on this picture, not too bad, the focus. So there are 5 extant species of rhinoceroses in the world. Many of you will know this, but I'll just re-go through it. So whereas it seems to me, when even the sort of person on the street, they sort of know that orangutans, gorillas, bonobos, and chimpanzees are different things. They live in different continents and different habitats. The same sort of applies to the rhino family, but people tend to lump them together in one sort of homogeneous mass, the 5 species globally. So 2 in Africa, 3 in Asia. That's one thing I want to say. So when you think about rhinos, we tend to think automatically, I think, of the white rhino, which is a success story in the sense that 150 years ago, it was almost on the verge of extinction in South Africa, and numbers have been brought up again to, that's wrong, I think it's 20,000 or so. So my sort of rather rude way of saying this is that the white rhino is not endangered. There's loads in different nations, different captive situations. They breed very well. Demography is good. We know about their diet. They're not endangered, but they're categorized as endangered. Whereas the so-called Sumatran or hairy rhino, here they've put down 30 remaining individuals, which is about right. Actually less than that now. It's about right. But my final point on this particular image is this, that I believe that knowing the numbers of a particular rare species is essentially irrelevant. And I say that because in the case of the hairy rhino, what sort of contributed in a big way to its extinction, or near extinction now, is the fact that they were very, very scattered. So the population density was much, much lower than it could be to sustain the numbers. And that obviously applies to many other species now. The other thing is, when, backtracking a bit, but when there was an earlier attempt in the 1980s and 90s, endorsed by IUCN, an attempt involving Indonesia, Malaysia, US and British zoos. There was quite a serious attempt to prevent the extinction of the Sumatran rhino in that era. And 40 rhinos were captured from Malaysia and Indonesia when in captivity. And of that number, say in Sabah, where I live, the northern bit of Borneo, there were 10 individuals of this species captured from what is now oil palm. And it turned out that 8 were mature males, 1 was a mature female, and 1 was a young female, possibly the daughter. So you can see straight away that 10 animals was useless because the demography was wrong. I think that's that. Next, another few introductory background bits. So this thing I'm showing now is a newspaper cutting from 1932. And perhaps the thing I want to say there is that a couple of things. So there was a man called Theodore Hubbard, who was a British man, who was what we now call an activist and a thorn in the side of all the other Brits in Malaysia in that era, 1920s, 1930s. And fortunately, he had enough funding to survive without a proper job. And he was a thorn in the side of the British administration for many years. And he had many achievements. One was the creation of Malaysia's first and only national park, Taman Negara. Forget the size, but it's a very, very big area of rainforest. And he managed to get that area of rainforest set aside in 1939, because the sultans, Malaysia has an old sultanate, so the sultans agreed to it, the British didn't. And the other reason was that particular lump of land was what everyone agreed at that time, 1930s, was so far away and so useless for cultivation that it wouldn't interfere with any human interests, business or social. So in that era, he was able to create an important protected area. And his argument was to save the Sumatran rhino. He thought that would be the refuge for the Sumatran rhino. In fact, the last one died there in year 2000 or thereabouts, not in my view from poaching, more because inherently the habitat was probably very, very marginal. The population there was very, very low. So essentially it was a big area, very suboptimal habitat. That's my opinion on that anyway. That's me in 1976. The only little point I want to make there is to draw your attention to the insidious effect of the shifting baseline syndrome, which I'm sure many of you are aware of in nature conservation. So what I want to say here, on the left is newspaper cutting from 1930s. 40 years later, I was a student studying squirrels as it happened. And we're now 50 years after that. What I want to sort of say is that the same things that Wildlife Commission, that Habak, the man I just mentioned, he did it out of his own money. He went around for about 8 months all over Malaya, asking what we'd now call stakeholder consultation. He asked all sorts of people what they think about wildlife. And it's exactly what you get today. Plantation managers want to exterminate wildlife. Rural people are split. Some are in favor, some are not. Urban people don't really care. The government also doesn't care. Basically, you get the same sort of thing 90 years later. Throughout this talk, I'm going to give a number of apparently disparate random factors, but I hope if you're sort of following most of what I say, you'll realize it's part of a bigger theme towards why did this species, this genus, go extinct in Malaysia. And by the way, I think it's probably going to go extinct in the next decade or two in Indonesia, probably. So this lovely photo, it's not a photo, an image I got from internet, but what it is, it shows Southeast Asia as if there'd been satellite imagery available 20,000 years ago. So let me have a quick, let me use a pointer. So here you probably know, but let me, for those who are not so sure. So this is what is sort of southern China, the southern part of China. This will be Bangladesh, Myanmar, Thailand around there, Peninsular Malaysia, Kuala Lumpur around there, Sumatra Island, Java Island, Borneo Island, and this background grayish color. So what the background, so the white is, the pale whitish is sea. But 20,000 years ago, which of course you'll realize is not very much in the geological time point of view. So with natural non-anthropogenic sea level rise from about 18,000 years ago to 6,000 years ago, that sort of time frame, sea levels rose 120 meters in this, as they did most of the world, in this region. So in that space of 18,000 to 6,000 years ago, roughly, you can see roughly half of the natural habitat, and I'm using habitat, not forests, about half of that was lost naturally. And accompanying that was higher temperatures, higher precipitation, and that allowed the spread or the re-spread, as I see it, of closed canopy rainforest, sort of 6,000 years onwards up to around now. And no one really knows, but one can imagine 20,000 years ago, you had a lot of more savanna-like circumstances of grasslands, forest edge, sparse tree cover up through most of that region, which of course is very conducive to large animals, whether that be herbivores or animals like tigers that prey on herbivores. So so I wanted to stress on a big scale, an enormous loss of natural habitat, probably not by no means all forests, a mixture, over a relatively short time span. And that's in preparation for the next image, which I hope many of you will be familiar with, but I need to explain it somewhat. So along the bottom axis, you got 0 to 100. And I think it's better to imagine that 0 to 100 in terms of percentage rather than absolute size. Don't think about the kilometers or forests. So you got on the left 0 habitat, and on the right 100% of your habitat. So that 100% could be that area I just showed you, which is usually called Sunderland or Sunderland. That's the geological word, that big landmass. So whether you think of that or you think of the Malaysian National Park, never mind. But the point is 100% of your habitat, you have by definition 100% of the species you expect to be there. And you see on the left side is number of species. So I hope you've got the sort of impression. So if you got 100% of the habitat, whatever it is, you've got everything there. 0, you've got nothing left. But the important thing is this curve. So if you also imagine that loss of about 50%, not only of habitat, but the lowland, which tends to be the richest in terms of plant productivity, tends to be habitat, you've lost quite a lot. And then coupled on that, the last 100, 150 years, another half of that habitat is gone. In the case of Malaysia, mostly to rubber and oil palm, not entirely. So you can add on another 50%. In other words, you could say 75% or more of the habitat that was there in the late Pleistocene, early Holocene is no longer there. And if I just quickly go back, crucially, you'll see, so the dark bits are highland, sort of 500 meters and above. So what you will see is just say Borneo alone, for example. I'll just outline briefly the island of Borneo. That's something, oopsie. So that would be the island of Borneo. So you have peat swamps in the south and the west, but most of the island is quite mountainous. I think I'm okay. Oh, okay. So let me just go back to this one. So my point here is that whatever you do, however many protected areas you set aside, you're going to lose a lot of species. And crucially, the loss of species will happen over centuries or millennia. So whereas a sort of someone, if you just talk to them on the street, might imagine extinctioning happening quite quickly. No, it doesn't. There's a long period of many years when the number of the species goes down and down and down. So I think I wanted to set that scene, which is relevant what I'm going to tell you hereafter. And as you'll see, very relevant to the let me call it the Sumatran rhino, because you probably know that term. Well, you can argue, as some people do, but this is a Sumatran rhino, Dicerrhinus sumatrensis, dug up in central southern China. It's a bronze wine vessel. It's in a museum in Beijing now. And the thing is, it's about 3,000 years old. So there is, of course, I cannot look at the original literature, but what is believed now is that this species' natural distribution, say at the end of the Pleistocene, early Holocene, would have been basically all of Southeast Asia. No one knows how far north they went in China, but they were certainly in southern China until a few thousands of years ago. And intriguingly to me, there's several things. One on this side, the pressure on hunting for this species was probably not for the horn. It was probably for the hide, for the skin. The reason being, before Chinese people famously invented gunpowder, they only had bows and arrows or crossbows. And so the hide of this species was the preferred armor over many centuries, probably 1 or 2 millennia, until firearms came into the picture. So what I'm sort of getting at here is that this species had a much bigger distribution and clearly a much bigger range of habitats in terms of vegetation and climate. This is a more recent thing. So this is an image from the Illustrated London News or something like that in 1872. The first individual of this species came to Europe in 1872, and this is the one. This is a female Sumatran rhino who was named Begum. who was captured in 1868 in what is now Bangladesh. And they kept her, whoever they were, they kept her there for a few years. And then the London Zoo in pre-Panda Day, they purchased her for equivalent of about £130,000 sterling, at that equivalent. And she was shipped to London Zoo. So this is coming out of her carrying crate into her paddock in London Zoo in 1872. Another intriguing thing to me, also relevant to what I want to say, is that of all Sumatran rhinos kept in captivity anywhere, she lived longer than any other rhino. And in more recent times, rhinos in captivity don't do well. And I think the main reason, there's a big element of luck, no doubt, but I think the main reason was that in that area, logically, in the winter months, she would have been fed on straw, probably a lot of holly twigs and bark, whereas, which is their natural diet. Their natural diet, they are woody, very sort of tannin-rich woody plant eaters, whereas modern zoos, of course, like to give pellets and apples and whatnot. So there's an element there of the influence of diet on these species. This is the last male Sumatran rhino in captivity in Malaysia, and he was under our care, BORA, Borneo Rhino Alliance care, until he died of kidney failure in May 2019. So apart from just showing it's a nice picture, I want to draw your attention to another behavioral ecological element to the story. So there's a muddy pool, you can see on the bottom right. So Tam, we called him Tam, was in a paddock of about a hectare of heavily log regenerating rainforest with a little night stool. So here he is in the middle of his paddock in 2017 or so. So the muddy pool was made by him and would have been made by any Sumatran rhino in the last 100 years anywhere they were. And they make the pool with their horn and with their feet, bit of a slope where there's overland flow of rain. Rainforest is okay, so there's rain sort of more or less through the year. So if you read in the books, the story is that they escape from biting flies and leeches. But I think the much more important thing almost certainly is that, and given that these rhinos wallow only between around 9 in the morning to 3 in the afternoon. So you could sort of argue it's there when they're in captivity, but I don't think so. So historically, this rhino in rainforest would wallow from about 9 to 3 in the afternoon, really for thermoregulation. I think they just get too hot. They don't have sweat glands, by the way. So they just cool down in this muddy pools, which, by the way, as a slight aside, probably contributed to the early demise of the species in mainland Asia, in the sense that, as I mentioned, I think getting the hide was a more important human use before the scam of selling rhino horns came a bit much later. But it would have been, so of all the large mammals in Southeast Asia, this species would have been the most easy to kill, basically with spears, because they're dozing in the middle hours of the day. No need for torches. You can go in and spear them. So they were much easier to slaughter than any other species historically. Oh, I forgot to warn you. I was warned to warn you, if you don't like blood, you should look away. Sorry about that. So another rhino we in our NGO captured in 2014 is this one, a female called Iman. Those of you who are familiar with Sabah, few of you are. She was captured in Danam Valley against all advice from all the authorities and NGOs. You shouldn't do it, but we knew by that, we should have known decades ago that leaving solitary animals in big areas of rainforests decade after decade and a slow decline in numbers, it should be common sense that the basic problem is they're not breeding enough, they're not meeting enough, and they're not breeding enough to sustain and recover the population. Should have been obvious, but clearly it was not obvious. Anyway, my point here is Iman is in her wallow in the middle of the day. Now, the other thing is, why is she bleeding? So it turns out that at an earlier phase, the one I mentioned of 1980s to 1990s, an IUCN endorsed capture program. Backtrack a little bit there. So I was fortunate, I was at the 2-day meeting in Singapore in October 1984. And there were 20 people present. I was the youngest and I was representing WWF at that time. So under IUCN umbrella, there were two factions. There was the Asian Rhino Specialist Group giving their opinion. There was what it used to be called the captive breeding specialist group under the IUCN umbrella. And then there were representatives from US zoos who were keen to get these rhinos in captivity. And then there were governments of Indonesia, Peninsular Malaysia, and Sabah to decide what are we going to do about this species going extinct. And of course, everyone had their own view, even with only 20 people. And there was clearly two factions, as there always are. There was a faction argued by the Asian Rhino Specialist Group. The rhinos should stay in the wild. That's where they belong. And there was the captive breeding group, who, of course, argued for captive breeding. So a compromise was reached whereby the compromise was that where breeding animals of this species are present, don't catch them because they're viable. You should catch the rhinos who are just solitary animals wandering around. And they were called doomed. Actually, the word in the final paragraph for doomed rhinos would be caught. But as I think you'll see, the problem there was that, and as it turned out, of the 40 rhinos captured between 1985 94 under that program, 40 in Malaysia, Indonesia, the sex ratio was okay, maybe because you had a big number, but the big problem was the old infertile animals were being captured. And it turned out, in fact, in the end, that only one compatible pair, both from Sumatra rather than Malaysia, a male and female, eventually ended up in Cincinnati Zoo, where they did breed because they were young and fertile and produced 3 babies in the end. But the other lesson from those 40 rhinos captured was that at least 70% of the females could never bear pregnancies, at least 70%, probably more, that's quite conservative. And the reason was that most of those females had never bred. And the reason was Sumatran rhinos tend to disperse from their mother far away, both males and females, as we know now. So the young animals would disperse at sexual maturity at very, very low population density. So the chances of natural pregnancies have been going down for decades in the rainforests of Borneo, Sumatra, and Malaya. And what that led to was this. So it turns out, now we know in retrospect, that female Sumatran rhinos, if they do not start bearing pregnancies when they're about 5 years old, when they're sexually mature, they start immediately to develop leiomyomas and cysts in the uterus. Leiomas being fibroids is the usual word. So as those fibroids build up over time, they get bigger and bigger. And as the animals move around, as they do, little blood vessels burst. So every so often, she will bleed from the uterus. So this is one of these cases. And we found that very quickly, even with a portable X-ray machine in the field, we found that there were leiomyomas in her uterus when she was still in the forest. So you're sort of building up a picture that there's a whole series of factors which I think meant leaving them in the forest was never going to be a way to regain the numbers, and that nutrition, food quality might have been a factor, which leads on to this particular image. This is Iman again. She died in November 2019, by the way, when the biggest leioma, which was 7 kilos of mass, ripped away near the joint with the cervix, and she died of massive blood loss. About nothing could be done. Anyway, what I want to show in this picture is this is Iman in her night stall. So you saw Tam, the male, in his forest paddock a few slides ago. So Iman, in this case, going to her night stall. So that's a voluntary place. We never forced any rhino to do anything. You'll be pleased to hear. So she would go into this little chute quite happily, where she could be weighed daily. There's a scales underneath, so we could monitor her body condition, and where we took blood every month to look at estrus cycle and general blood parameters. But the most important thing of this chute is that she would learn to come there and eat, so we could make sure her nutrition was optimum. So what is optimum nutrition? In this case, we had 3 young men full-time going out with machetes, parangs, cutting twigs like this one you see in this picture every day. And at one stage we had 3 rhinos, so it was about 150 kilos daily of mixed leaves. And we deliberately had a mix of different plant species, knowing that woody plants was their favorite. But it was several things were apparent. So the first thing was that she would only eat small amounts of any one species. She would eat a bit and then just keep still and wait for another different species to come along. So clearly she was selecting for, probably by smell, selecting for a variety of plants. That was one thing. Second thing was that all the favored plant species were not closed canopy rainforest species. They're woody plants, but they're pioneer plants, forest edge species, which you always thought was to do with the chemistry. So there is things like dipterocarps are full of fiber and tannins. The things she liked were light on that and more on light fiber and some minerals and water. So that was the second thing. So the variety, selection of only some species, preferring pioneer woody plants. The third one, which was most telling to me, was this. So as you recall, she was weighed daily, more or less anyway, so we could monitor body condition through weight fluctuation. And the thing was, their body, 3 rhinos, all of them, the body weight would decline if they were fed only leaves and twigs, which was obviously their preferred diet. So we had to feed these rhinos 300 grams of commercial horse pellets daily to keep the body condition stable, which implies very strongly to me that even with their favored diet, there were missing elements or components in their diet. We never knew what. My suspicion is the things they were going for in the pellets, physiologically anyway, was probably calcium and phosphorus, maybe proteins, I don't know. But I think the big picture to me was that tropical rainforest is a really inhospitable environment for this species, as you'd expect for a big, massive animal. So there's lots of woody vegetation, very poor quality. Historically, they would probably need to go to natural concentrated mineral sources, which, as you'll understand, are very limited now because protected areas for wildlife, whether that be Malaysia or Indonesia or anywhere in the region, basically protected areas for wildlife in that region are land that no one else wants, like the National Park of Malaysia 90 years ago. That could only be established by lobbying from activists and grudgingly agreed by the government of the day. So protected areas, and I've seen this again in Danam Valley in Sabah, for example. I won't go into that detail, but all the big protected areas in Southeast Asia are basically extremely marginal or useless for humans. So those habitats that these animals are supposed to be in are what is politically possible at any one period through lobbying by activists. Next. So I'm going to gratuitously show you a little bit about how we got these rhinos. It's not a particular part of the story, but what I want to tell you here is the enormous effort and expense that has gone into preventing the extinction of Sumatran rhinos on the ground over 50 years now. And it's all gone to waste because people make the wrong decisions, but I'll come back to that later. So on the left, you see a hole being dug in the ground. So when we sort of got permission to catch these rhinos. And as it turned out, by the way, there are only 3 left in the wild in Malaysia when we started this work in 2008. And I'm quite sure of that. We captured the last 3. So how to capture them? So having got over the hurdle of catching them and some people not liking that, the next thing was how to catch them. We chose holes in the ground. That's it's an old, simple, tested method for catching big mammals, at least in tropical rainforest. In this particular, so the hole is 8 feet long, 4 feet wide, 6 feet deep, which is just right for an average adult Sumatran rhino, and by luck happens to be there. So it can be lined with plywood, and plywood comes in 8 by 4 feet bits in Malaysia. So the pit is dug. Backtrack on this one. So you can sort of see it's rock. So we had men for 2 weeks with hammers and chisels cutting out this hole on a ridgetop. And as you'll understand, when with big mammals in tropical rainforests, they can go anywhere. And we wasted about 2 years on government instruction building these traps near rivers. And the excuse was you need water. If you catch the animal, there's usually water nearby. Anyway, that didn't work. So we started building traps on ridgetops and got this Iman. So this is Iman a few hours after she fell into the, excuse me, the hole. And of course, the water's needed to, well, for drinking water, also to cool them down, crucially, because in a few hours in a pit in tropical humid rainforests, they need to be cooled down with water. So not as an afterthought, but by very careful prior planning and fundraising, we were not allowed to build roads in to get these rhinos out. And that's because, you know, when you have a meeting room with various stakeholders, most of them imagine a road is something like we have outside here. But what we meant by a road was a tracked excavator and a very old Land Rover, sort of bulldozing through the forest. And it would have closed over after 6 months. But the policy was no roads in protected areas. Okay. So fortunately, in that era, which is 2010, 2015, in Borneo Island, there was a company in Sarawak which was using these Ericsson air cranes to take out very valuable large logs from remote hill forests. So at great expense, we got donations from Sime Darby Foundation to bring those helicopters over to bring, actually in the end, 2 rhinos, Iman and another female, out of the rainforest. And just by the way, it's not obvious, whoops, again. That's the crate. So the crate is brought out from hill forest with the rhino inside. Doable, but needs a lot of preparation and is very expensive. Yeah, leave it at that. So that gives you some idea. So this is Tam and the other female, which I'm not going to talk about, Puntong, who was captured in Tabin Wildlife Reserve in 2011. So we went through the routine of trying natural breeding, sort of knowing that it wouldn't really work for all sorts of reasons I won't go into now. So some of you may know there's an international team working on bringing back the northern white rhino in Africa now. I won't go into that, but what I wanted to say was that team under Thomas Hildebrand from Leibniz Institute for Zoo and Wildlife Research in Berlin, and Cesare Galli, a private in vitro mammal person from Italy. They did actually try, in fact, many occasions came to Sabah to get gametes, semen from Tam, egg cells from Iman and Puntong, once or twice a year from about 2011 to 2019 when they died. So this is on the left is Iman under general anesthesia at a sort of either once or twice a year removing egg cells, which of course is risky and difficult. And we had, I always can't remember, but somewhere between 15 and 16, that sort of order of attempts at in vitro fertilization using semen and rhino eggs, either in Malaysia or Cesare. So I just point out this gentleman, because he does say that it's English people and Germans that get the glory. So I'm pointing out Cesare Galli would bring in two little tubes, one with semen and one with egg cells, back to his lab in Italy. And so both Malaysians and Indonesians and Italians and Germans tried in vitro fertilization with our gametes, and it didn't work. None of the attempts were successful. And we all thought almost certainly the animals are very old. It's like, it's just, if you have a choice, you don't choose the oldest, poorest quality animals, so to speak, for in vitro fertilization using ova and sperm. So that attempt didn't work out. And the other thing, so the technical side was getting difficult in terms of can one apply assisted reproductive technology to help contribute more to making more embryos and baby rhinos. That was the thinking. So this picture is me in 2014 in Jakarta in Ministry of Forestry. But the even bigger challenge, other than any of the technical bits or the funding, the bigger challenge was how to collaborate on one program. One thing I didn't make very, very clear at the beginning I should have done. Over the last few decades, the only Sumatran rhinos have been in Malaysia or Indonesia. Some people doubt that, but that's pretty much how it is. So in our view, it was essential to have a collaborative program, Indonesia and Malaysia, to prevent the extinction. So as always, politics got in the way, and in the upshot was Indonesia never really wanted to collaborate with Malaysia. I think it's fair to say that. So so the main undermining of the effort was two key nations not wanting to collaborate with each other. Let me see. Ah, yeah, okay. I wonder, this is a sort of slightly different but very relevant. So the animal is a Malayan tapir. Similar sort of thing, a three-toed woody plant-eating ungulate, very ancient genus family. The picture quality is poor because it's taken from a newspaper article year 2000. So if you bear with me a bit, so the idea is this tapir had come out of forest into someone's garden. You can see a house and coconut. And this is another thing that, in my view, is really undermining management of wildlife in the tropics. Human beings want to rescue animals. So if they see any animal where it's not supposed to be, they'll rescue it. And sadly, there's many mainstream NGOs and governments funding this whole rescuing animals. I mean, unless they're really a risk to human life, my own view would be just leave them where they are, because either they know what they're doing or they're young mature animals dispersing, so just leave them there. But that sort of thinking is still not there yet. So the fire and rescue brigade, in this case, were called to rescue the tapir. Whatever happened, no one knows. Probably they captured her and dumped her in some forest elsewhere. But as a sort of an aside, but a relevant one, is that when those last two rhinos died under our care in Sabah, in Payne Wildlife Reserve in 2019, and it was clear that Indonesia wasn't keen on collaborating with Malaysia, there's this thing called the Malayan tapir, which up until a few thousands of years ago was on Borneo Island. It was one of those species that's gone extinct slowly over 20,000 years in Southeast Asia. And now they're only in southern Thailand, Peninsular Malaysia, and Sumatra, no longer in Borneo. And that was a purely natural extinction. We don't need to go into why, but that's a natural extinction. So our thinking in BORA was, why not, since we have paddocks and night stalls for a big wood-eating ungulate, we have Dr. Zainal, the vet, who's been looking after rhinos. By the way, he looked after them. It's the 1980s, the early batch. And our own staff, we know exactly what to do. Why don't we get tapirs into Payne Wildlife Reserve as an ecological equivalent of the now extinct Sumatran rhino? But humans being what they are, it wasn't allowed. The national at senior level, the Sabah government didn't want Malayan tapirs to come to Sabah because they were worried then Peninsular Malaysia would demand orangutans. And at state level, there was concern that a Malayan animal is out of place in Borneo, not realizing the whole historical background. And equally sadly was my NGO colleagues who said this is a waste of money. You should spend it on more important things. But the final death knell to bringing tapirs from West Malaysia and trying them out in Sabah was the IUCN Tapir Specialist Group, who said that it's more important to conserve the animals in their natural habitat. Our own view was that probably like rhinos, natural habitat is not closed canopy rainforest, and we have ideally very heavily logged forest. Payne, by the way, 120,000 hectares of logged forest regenerating. We thought it was ideal tapir habitat. But all those things conspired to an opportunity, in my view, to have a new population in the same nation. The various human opinions killed that idea. And as you see, I'm quite annoyed by that even now, a few years later. Now, coming on, in a way, sort of part two, looking at the time, part two of this presentation. Let me give you some background while you're looking at this. So 2019, we had no more rhinos, no more money, and wondered what to do. But so under Dr. Zainal, the veterinarian in our team, and these young people here, In 2011, when we were much more optimistic and thought there would be several rhinos and we could work with Indonesia and we could make them breed. So in 2011, Dr. Zeinel said, well, rather than keep sending out young men every day over huge areas to get woody plants, and by the way, other NGOs told us not to get plants except those in rainforest because they were worried that plants outside the forest were contaminated by herbicides. Complete nonsense, but that was the pressure we had from other fellow NGOs. Anyway, so Zeinel started building up what at that time in 2011 he called a rhino food garden. The idea, as you can imagine, being to plant their favorite food species, pollard or coppice them, so you always have at least some of the daily diet for our what was 3 rhinos then, daily food. So it turned out when those rhinos died tragically in 2019, we had what I would call an arboretum. Dr. Zeinel insisted we call it the Subophycus Germplasm Center. But what it was that most of those rhino foods are of one genus, Ficus, which I'm sure you know of, Ficus. There's only one species, I guess, in UK, but 150 species of native ficus plants in Borneo. And the ficus species range from big trees, small trees, montane, riverside, swamp, lianas, epiphytes, the big banyan strangling figs. But the thing about figs for the rhinos, well, for us in managing them, was there's many species. They're very robust. They grow quickly. Wherever you have a lot of fig species, you have constant fruit and young leaves, unlike the majority of woody rainforest plants, which are very seasonal in their leaf flushing and flower production. Figs have young leaves and fruits through the year, especially so if you have lots of species in one place. So we transformed this this food garden arboretum to a germplasm center in Tabin Wildlife Reserve. So that then opened up another opportunity, an opportunity which I'm going to outline in a moment. Let me just show you the picture. Yeah. So it's to do with this, orangutans and oil palm. And I guess many of you are aware of this. So every few years, someone somewhere wants to pick a fight. And it can either be the Malaysian side ranting about Western NGOs and white people, or it can be a Western NGO ranting about Malaysia not saving its orangutans because there's too much oil palm. Now, of course, the debate is totally useless because the oil palm is already there. It's not like it's a future thing. It's already there, and it's a big part of the economy. So, so that was that. So with that background, I'm going to show you another few pictures on this slide and tell you what they are. So it turns out, and I can say this quite confidently because I've lived in this place for 45 years now. So what used to be logged forest by that time, 1980s, what used to be logged forest containing orangutans, now, starting from 1985 to 95, that time, there was a big wave of converting forest to oil palm. So now that's what used to be an entirely forest landscape. The land cover in this area, and I'm thinking of about 500,000 hectares in eastern Sabah. 500,000 hectares. Mostly you see sort of low hills, gentle hill slopes. So now that is about 90% oil palm ground cover, 1% village and people, and 9% forest. And the forest can come in many ways. It can come as small forest reserves run by the forest department, a bit of wildlife sanctuary along the river, so-called high conservation value forests, which come part and part of the roundtable on sustainable palm oil initiative, riparian zones. So you get these patches of forest all over the landscape. So with that background, what you see is you see two sort of things. So on the right, this is a mother and baby orangutan. This is a young male. So those were just taken with an iPhone or equivalent by my staff, the people you saw a few slides ago, going around monitoring. So what it turns out, this is not my research, but many people know about it now. So in this mixed landscape, female orangutans now after 30 or 40 years live in forest patches, and very roughly 20 hectares of degraded forest provides enough food for one female orangutan, more or less. And the males, so these are just pictures taken by plantation workers. That's a male orangutan walking along a terrace, recently planted oil palm. This one is a male orangutan walking across the road in a much bigger landscape of thousands of hectares. So that the society that orangutans have evolved post that expansion of oil palm is females refuging in forest patches, males moving very long distance, certainly many kilometers, I think tens of kilometers easily, between the forest patches to mate, and then babies are born. Now, although this is changing, the response over the last 50 years has been to rescue these animals. This is why I mentioned rescue earlier with the tapir. So whereas you have a sort of stable system of in my view, very low population density, about one orangutan per 8 square kilometers on average, which for an orangutan is not that bad. They're normally at a very low population density. So you have this stable system of orangutans, but the males are being pulled out, being rescued. And this has been going on 40 years now. So hopefully you see where I'm going with this. So you would imagine if you can keep the orangutans there, their big problem will be getting enough food through the year to sustain themselves and breeding. So we transmogrified that rhino food garden now as an arboretum or germplasm center with 90 ficus species. And of those 90, we have about 20 sort of starring ones that do easy to propagate and do quite well in a variety of habitats. So on the edge of that subaficus germplasm center in Payne Wildlife Reserve, you'll see this sort of picture with Dr. Zainal. What we've done is put out for hardening a few tens of Ficus racemosa, one of the species, which we will then plant out in oil palm plantations, of course, with the permission of the manager. So sort of snaps of this. So Zainal and Alvin on an oil palm plantation edge, loads of weeds. That's the thing. To me, the main thing that comes out is there's ferns, beremia, various weed species. And on the right, not exactly the same, but a few hundred meters away, the same site 2.5 years later, whereby those seedlings of multiple ficus species are planted out. You need lots of weeding, but after, in this picture, 2.5 years, you get the beginnings of a sort of forest canopy, multiple species, almost all ficus, not quite all, mostly. So our thinking is big scale, long term, sustain those orangutans in the mixed forest oil palm landscape. Crucially, by no more rescue, even more crucially, making sure there's enough food throughout the landscape. So as of now, our funds are pretty much run out, but we've put out ficus in eight big growers, the big oil palm growers in Eastern Sabah in 13 estates. Yet again, there's many people who say it's a waste of time and money, you should save the forest. But this doesn't preclude saving rainforest. This is, in our view, a way of sustaining a very sparse population in a mixed oil palm forest landscape. The irony to me is that despite much trying, neither national government nor any oil palm grower have latched onto the very reasonable possibility of greenwashing, saying they're helping to save orangutans, which I'd really welcome, but it hasn't been taken up by any of the companies. Yeah. And what in the longer term we want to see is this, right? So you've got a mature Ficus racemosa tree. This one will be about 30, it's not ours, it's about 30 years old in an oil palm plantation, orangutans eating them. So that's the orangutan bit. And through time constraints, we have a number of programs going on involving tigers, wild cattle, Bornean bearded pigs. But the one I want to come on now, also to do with oil palm, but a very different perspective, is to do with elephants. So the next slide I'm going to show you, before I show it, well, I'll show it now. So the pale blue is Payne Wildlife Reserve. I mean, so the boundary is, is this sort of thing like that. That's it. And that was a sort of fairly arbitrary line legislated in 1984. That's point number one. All the other colors are oil palm, largely. So the white is sea, but all the colors are largely oil palm around, as you see, around the Payne Wildlife Reserve. So each spot, this is WWF Malaysia data, not mine, so I can't answer questions exactly. But each spot is is a record of one of several elephants that were satellite tracked and are still being done over several years in this region. So those spots represent 3 herds. And if you look at the key over the period 2016, over 6 years, you've got lots of spots. I don't think it really matters that we don't know which animals and which animals we missed. The point I want to show here is that if you look at where the elephants are, about half their time is in Payne Wildlife Reserve, where they're supposed to be, and about half their time is outside in oil palm. And as a pairing to that, next slide is the same thing, but different color scheme. This is from WWF. So the spots here represent just 1 month, 3 satellite tracked herds of elephants. And what you'll see here is there's one small herd that's sort of wandering about along there. But almost all the records are in oil palm plantations. And elephants go into oil palm. There's several things here. So number one, this particular one is not necessarily a typical case. So in this particular image, you see elephants, part of a bigger herd, and they've come out to eat recently felled oil palms. So as you may possibly know, the general rule in Malaysia and Indonesia is that after about 25 years, old palms, the yield is already going down, which is true. And the height of the palm is very high, so harvesting is difficult. So the general rule in that region is 25-year cycle. So when the palms are 25 years old, they're cut down and new palms will be planted. But elephants go for that. They go for the growing shoots. They go for the mushed up, the bits of the palm trunk. But they also go for any palms. Essentially, they go for oil palms. And to me, it's very obvious now that elephants, in this case in Sabah, in Borneo, elephants, their survival as a species is 100% dependent on the existence of oil palm. Many of my colleagues, including in WWF, don't agree with me. They say, well, there's plenty of food in the forest. It's true, there's a lot. But if you're an elephant that needs to eat 100 kilos of food per day, and you need preferentially to go to monocot plants, which have a lot fewer natural toxins in them. So an elephant can live in rainforest, but it really needs to focus its time on looking for monocot plants, no toxics in them. And monocots, as you'll realize, are either palms or grasses. So in this case, the palms are oil palms. So they're really dependent on oil palms. And all the young elephants, of course, have learned from their mother, if you want food, you go into the oil palm. That's where the food is. So that's the sort of scenario of elephants eating palms and probably dependent on them to survive as breeding populations. Now, next slide, I'm going to show you an image on the edge of Payne Wildlife Reserve 3 years ago. So in this case, so the forest department in Sabah doesn't allow us to cut down trees. I think they're wrong, but we're in the era that if you plant trees, you're okay. If you don't plant trees or cut them down, you're considered sort of bad news. So we have to choose sites where there's no tree cover for whatever historical background. So this is a patch of about 20 hectares on the southern edge of Payne Wildlife Reserve. So jointly, Borneo Rhino Alliance and the nearby oil palm grower, KLK, starting 3 years ago, we've jointly created managed pastures, managed grasslands for elephants. And as you'll understand, the idea is to, over a big scale, long term, to help wean elephants away from the oil palm to an alternative food source inside where they're supposed to be. And that food source is largely grass, not entirely. And again, as you'll understand, the good thing about grazing on grass from a manager's point of view is that the grass will grow back again, unlike any other crop. Palms are destroyed when they're eaten. Grasses will grow back again. And what we've found is, so this is 3 years later, the same spot from a drone image. So the gray things are elephants eating rough grass in the grassland river nearby. And in fact, what we've found is that the grass grows so rapidly, we have to keep, well, there's 2 things. One is woody plants keep coming in, so we have to pull them out manually, big cost of manpower. The other thing is the grass grows so fast that elephants can't keep up with it. So elephants will come, normally when the grass is about 1 meter tall, before flowering. That's what they target. So the grass grows so quickly, so we have to also have manpower cutting the grass. And because there's no farming nearby, we'd like to give away the grass, but no one wants it, so we just leave it on the ground. Anyway, point being, if you get the picture, we're trying to create concentrated feeding grounds for elephants to bring them away in the long term out of the oil palm. Second but one slide. In this same place, you see our staff and the KLK managers there. So what's happening here is there's an old tree stump, a Borneo ironwood. We put pebbles around it. We're going to cement it up so there's a sort of a clear base. And in that old stump, we put 10-kilogram blocks of commercially available. We can buy them easily in Sabah, agricultural state. So we buy these blocks of multi-minerals intended for cattle and goats, domestic livestock. And those mineral blocks contain sodium, copper, iron, calcium, phosphorus, selenium, trace elements. And we put them there, and the elephants will lick the minerals, as will many other things, including macaque monkeys. Everything goes for it. But it's part of, I hope you realize from what I said earlier, my belief that not presence, but productivity of plant material for big herbivores is a key limiting factor. Limiting in general, and certainly limiting in terms of trying to recover depleted populations. So we're in process of creating more pastures and more mineral blocks. And that, in reality, we find every 2 months or so we have to top them up because rain and animals have licked it all up. So very last slide, and I've very brutally condensed everything. I've told you quite a lot, and there's a lot more to tell, which I don't have time, but I've brutally put down two things of concern, which is apart from funding, of course, the big constraints for the sort of things that I'm advocating for. So one I put very broadly under human failings. And I'd say on balance, that's the biggest headache of all. My experience, as I've rather churlishly mentioned several times, everything we propose, there's always someone who will stops it. So even planting the grass is illegal. We just do it. In Tabin Wildlife, we're not allowed to plant grass, but we do anyway. So how one deals with this human cognitive biases, them and us, opinions, emotions, I do not know. I think it's impossible. The other big thing, as my other theme is nutrition. I really believe that when you get small clusters of endangered large animals in tropical conditions, leaving aside poaching, which I haven't even touched on, I really think the biggest constraint and limiting factor is that their nutrition is not sufficient to sustain the population, recover numbers. In my view, that the key thing to do is whether that be pigs and deer for tigers, which I haven't even mentioned, grass for elephants, fig plants for orangutans. You need to boost the amount and the productivity of where those animals are now. And that's it. I'm going to leave it at that. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. It's both somber, but actually really enlightening as well in some of these elements. And as an ecosystem ecologist, I particularly appreciated your point about the importance of food reserves as well.
And big scale.
Keeping,
yes, yeah.
Okay, we can open up to questions. Does anybody want to kick off with a question? Kim?
Well, thank you for a really interesting talk. There's lots of food for thought. I wanted to pick up on something you said very early on that I didn't quite catch about school students being involved or 18-year-olds being involved. Did you say something about that at the beginning in Sabah?
I can't recall. It might have been that most of our staff, and there's 18 including me, are young school or early school leavers. It was not a big issue. Maybe to say there's me as the sort of nominal boss, a vet, admin people, and all the rest are people who left school at age 16 or 17, who we've taken up and now experts, but they're early school leavers.
Could you expand a little bit on how they came to be doing that? I'm just interested in.
This is an intriguing question. It's a bit of a curveball, but I think I can answer. Mostly word of mouth. Okay, so since you asked this question, I'll tell you the truth. So we inherited a team who's in 2008, whose job already had been looking for rhinos. And in 2008, we realized it was a hopeless task, right? You can look for rhinos, but if you don't do anything, there's no point. So we were left with those people. A big challenge for several years was lack of discipline, particularly drinking, alcohol problems and smoking. We banned it all. So we weeded out, frankly, we weeded out a lot of people by issuing warning letters. So those that drink too much or smoke too much were got rid of. But that set the scene for a more gentle, informal way. So we don't advertise, we never advertised. So it's sort of word of mouth. Someone has a cousin working in the forest department whose salary is very low. So it's sort of built up. There's still a bit of a turnover, but less than one per year now. We have a nice mix. So those the survivors from that early day who weren't strong drinkers who are still there, they were in their 20s then. Now they're men with wife and children and 40s. Our youngest will be 19 or 20 now. So essentially, in summary, that's the background, and it's very much word of mouth. And if people want to leave, they can. And crucially, I'm going to mention this in this snowflakey age. The discipline of how do I put this politely? Letting go the problem stuff proved to be very useful in the long term.
Thank you.
Thank you, John.
Not a mystery, it's you. Hi.
So I've been lucky enough to be going to Sabah for about 25 years now. And you talked about the rhino, you talked about the tapir, which used to be on Borneo, but not recently. And in the time I've been going, in the 25 years, the story with the elephant has changed a lot. So I just wondered if it might be interesting for people, including me, to hear the latest on the sort of status of the elephant in terms of how native it is in Sabah.
Oh, do you think about the native bit or the bigger picture or both?
But well, the native bit, but
all right. Oh goodness, can you give me 5 minutes? This is a long story in itself. So my estimate in 1982 of the number of elephants, just based on what one could see, was 500 to 2,000. No statistic. It was just definitely that's a minimum, that's a maximum. So you can sort of guess there are about 1,000 or so. Probably that's most likely before the oil palm happened. So from that time up until around 1994, the way in Sabah, not West Malaysia, Sabah, to solve the elephant problem was to kill them, either poison them or shoot them. And that was perfectly legal. They were a game animal or something like that, right? So the numbers, and given that the lowlands have gone to oil palm, you can imagine that at least half of their habitat went away and they were being killed. So I cannot, no one will ever know, but I imagine by the late 1990s, there'll be sort of half the number there were previously, whatever that number is. But again, you could guess it was in the mid-hundreds at that time, 1998, 99. So the elephant was put on some sort of protected status in 94, 95, which meant it was very difficult to legally kill them. And if I come up to now, a few years ago, the government of Sabah was very proud that no one can kill any elephant for any reason whatsoever. So if you get injured elephants, you're not allowed to kill them. You have to save them. And someone has to be responsible for looking after elephants for 40, 50 years and all the costs that entails, which to my mind is very foolish. But what I imagine is numbers sort of went down like that and have been going up again since your time up to around now. If you just, and you would have seen this, if you see, there's lots of video clips and photos of elephants in Sabah now. I mean, you can see them quite easily. It's quite clear to me there's no problem in breeding. There's always infants, 1 year, 2 year, 4 year, 6 year old in every group. So they're, unlike the rhino, their breeding is fine. And I do believe the numbers are creeping up. Unfortunately, the mainstream NGOs insist that they're endangered and the numbers are going down, which is nonsense, but that's what you see in public domain. So it puts government in a bit of a trap, right? The NGOs, and I won't mention the names in this case, are pretending the numbers are going down and we need more money to save them, which is not a very clear thing what that means. But I said that to give you the big picture. Okay, so the other thing in my early years in Sabah, that was 1980. So if you look at the distribution of elephants then and now, it's about the same. There's a bit of shifting around, but essentially it's the same. And if you look on maps of forest type geology and soil, one thing that stood out and still stands out very clearly is a very close relationship with surface deposits of kaolin clay, which you'll remember are called mud volcanoes in Sabah. But in fact, there's this enormous layer in eastern Sabah, volcanic ash laid down in seawater over several million years, and it's got seawater and methane, so it bubbles up. But you know these things, right? So they can be just like that sort of size or a hectare or more. So that correlation is the same as the distribution of elephants in Sabah, exactly the same. So you would speculate there's some link between this kaolin clay. We know elephants eat it, by the way. We ourselves have seen it, and from drone imagery at nighttime as well. So they eat this clay, and what I used to think was they're going for sodium, but I tend to think, going back to your main story, right? I tend to think that the curious distribution of elephants in Sabah, which I never mentioned, which is 5% of the island, the northeastern tip, is linked to the kaolin clay, and it might be that the kaolin clay is sufficient, if they're imbibing it frequently, sufficient to ameliorate the adverse effects of too much woody vegetation in the absence of grass and palms. That's what I tend to think. But there's a coda to this story in the sense that if you look at the very sparse literature, it seems on Sulu Island, Holo Island, up until the early 19th century, there were elephants on Holo Island. And the literature is sparse, but it was believed when the white people first went to Southeast Asia, the story was that those elephants came from Java around 1395, when the king of Java gave a pair of elephants to the king of Sulu. So it remains possible those elephants are Javanese elephants derived from one pair. I tend to favor that view. But then the thing was complicated 2 years ago when people looked at the fossils from Nia caves in Sarawak, which had been mouldering in a drawer since 1957. They found Limachen, found fragments of molars of the same genus, Elephas, dating from about 40,000 years ago in Sarawak. So you can sort of pay your money and pick your choice, right? Either they were widespread and just ended up in eastern Sabah, or they all went extinct like the tapir, the Javan rhino, and the Javan elephants were brought in. I don't think anyone will ever work that out. I think it's one of those things that will be uncertain. I think I better limit it to that story for now.
Okay.
I see, it's still okay.
Thank you. If you
It's online, doesn't it?
okay, if you imagined yourself, let's say 400 years into the future,
Oh, I can
looking back to here, what do you wish people like yourself and this audience would do
Blimey.
that might actually work in that 400-year period? I could ask it another way.
No, that's fine. My friend Jonathan Spencer, I think I'm going to frame what I think he would say as a temporary. Not that, the original one. That how to frame it.
Being really hard-headed.
It would be it would be. Let me use this word I was told this afternoon, no longer popular. Rewilding. Is it still popular? Anyway.
The students could discuss that, but I think it's.
Let's leave that aside, right? We'll use that umbrella term. So the era of, leaving aside climate change is all right. The era of habitat loss.
Take it into account. Be realistic.
I do. Oh God, that's even more difficult.
There might be only one part of Southeast Asia that will survive.
You're right. It might be a few.
So which part would you focus on?
Oh goodness, geographically. Oh goodness, there's two elements now. So my first response is, leaving aside the climate change, will be the habitat losses happened. The protected areas are not going to be expanded, more or less, right? You live with that and don't keep complaining about it. And why I mentioned rewilding is one could imagine elephants not in oil palm, but you can imagine them in a mixed woodland. You can certainly, in my view, imagine wild cattle and orangutans in oil palm plantations because they don't do much damage. So my answer there is to do with imagining a future with even eucalyptus plantations. We have wild cattle living them in Sabah, for example, right? You can imagine a much bigger picture, go away from protected areas towards how does the landscape, whatever it might be, play a role in preventing extinctions, trees as well. Goodness, the more difficult one Climate change. Oh, actually, I'm a bit, on the one, I'm a bit pessimistic about Sabah, where I am, because it's the eastern lowlands that we work in might be under the sea in 50 years, let alone 400. On the other hand, look from the human political point of view, for whatever historical background, in that region, Sabah is quite focused and open to new ideas. So, for example, if you work in West Malaysia or Indonesia, you'll have much bigger trouble in setting up a program. Sabah's easier. So in the political, social sense, Sabah would be a better bet. And I really can't think of anything else to say.
Thank you.
Fascinating talk, so thank you very much indeed. My sort of objective analysis of what you've talked about, and I've read a little bit before what you were espousing is solution isn't the protected areas, it's the fringe, or it's getting palm oil operators to work with the local communities and conservationists, so that commercial landscapes are hybrid. Is that the only hope?
Not only, but it's a big part of it. I mean, I go back to elephants again as the example. Probably there has to be some relaxation of the mania for planting trees and allowing savannas and pastures in some protected areas. But yeah, I tend to think that is it. Find ways, and it would be not small orders, big corporations to allocate some land.
And who typically owns the palm oil landscape? Is it government owned, private individuals? Is it?
The bulk are public listed companies listed on the Kuala Lumpur Stock Exchange. That would account for, depending on who you ask, but sort of 3/4, probably more. And the shareholders are not only Malaysians. I mean, a lot of global investors will invest in Malaysian palm oil stocks.
And so is it in their interest to have hybrid landscapes?
You've opened up a whole other hours of talk now. Potentially,
that subject dominated the last 10 days.
Yeah, I did. There is potential. I mean, Jonathan, if I can summarize in the short time, oil palm is so profitable, there's not much incentive to do anything. So, for example, Jonathan, I'm going to give you one thing, is that, so in the British landscape, apparently quite big land areas that are farmed lose money and only survive, A, because people can't change, and B, they get subsidies. And I think similarly in oil palm plantations, big chunks of land actually probably waste money in terms of labor in the steep slopes, too much fertilizer that runs away. So it looks like that big oil palm management units, they survive because they're so profitable, but it doesn't mean that every bit of land is profitable. And in fact, one can only imagine a time where set-asides on the least productive for palm oil land can be used for nature conservation. But it's a long way off, and I stress mainly because palm oil is so profitable, there's not any great incentive to change in any way, as I see it.
Okay, I think we should wrap up, and the next round of BORA is
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
This is not forced on you. This book is available if anyone's interested. I'm going to have to charge you. Institutions will give them, but if it's an individual, I'll have to £30. Just so you know, anyway. Okay, thanks, Yavinda.
Thank you.